Good morning and welcome to another edition of United Way for Southeastern Michigan's What's the Word Wednesdays. My name is Courtney Howe, and today we are going to be looking back at the history of the Tulsa Massacre with writer Philip Lewis, a Detroit native and fellow Renaissance High School alum. The last 10 minutes of today's conversation are reserved for questions, so please leave your questions in the Q&A box if you're watching on Zoom or in the comment box on Facebook. Now, I would like to introduce Eric Ibrahim, United Way Senior Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, to say a few words. Andre?
Thank you, Courtney. Over the last weekend, United Way for Southeastern Michigan wrapped up our very first ever 21-day equity challenge. Over 5,000 members from communities across the region joined us on a journey to deepen our understanding and develop our willingness to confront racism, sexism, and other forms of inequity and inequality right here in our backyard in Southeastern Michigan. At United Way, that journey does not end with the equity challenge. We remain committed to combating systemic racism and advancing equity and inclusion for all. We must remember and learn the history of discrimination and oppression in the United States that has fostered deeply ingrained institutional bias, resulting in gross racial and ethnic disparities in education, income, housing, business ownership, home ownership, and countless key aspects of a free and prosperous life. To explore a piece of that history, we will be joined today by Philip Lewis, who will discuss the 100th year anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Philip is currently a senior front page editor at Huffpost. His journalism career began in 2015 as an editorial fellow at the Huffington Post in Washington, D.C. He is the co-author of Schoolhouse Wreck, the Betsy DeVos Story, an inside look into the life of the U.S. Secretary of Education. Philip was also a 2017 recipient of the prestigious Paul Miller Washington Reporting Fellowship. Born and raised in the D, Philip received his undergraduate degree from Michigan State University in sociology. Philip, welcome to What's the Word Wednesdays. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks y'all for having me. I really appreciate that really great intro. Hi everyone, again, my name is Phil Lewis. I really want to thank you for spending 30 minutes out of your workday to listen to me talk. I promise it will be as painless as possible. But to get started, when I was putting this presentation together, I wanted to try to make this talk as interactive as possible. So I want to take you to my trip to Greenwood Avenue in Tulsa, Oklahoma, as much as I can through Zoom link. So in this presentation, I've compiled some of the best pictures and video I was able to take during my trip to Black Wall Street, and I want to give you context behind the visuals. I also found some interesting parallels between how we talk about racism today and being from Detroit. I'd be able to give you some sort of historical perspective to that. To the next slide. The first day I got to Tulsa, I really wanted to take in everything that was around me. It was still a bit early for me to check into my Airbnb, but I didn't want to wait around. I wanted to go see Black Wall Street, so I just went straight there with my luggage. It hadn't quite hit me yet that I was standing in this space where a century prior, one of America's deadliest acts of domestic terrorism took place. It's kind of hard to describe, but the air was a bit oppressive. And I don't think it was simply the heat. It was a hot day, but there was a weight there. I could feel the full weight of what we came to commemorate. So on the screen, you see pictures of Greenwood Avenue right now. There's this Black Wall Street corner store that I went inside. There's the street, Greenwood Avenue right there. There's a mural. And these are just sort of like I guess I'm trying to describe the area. It's basically a strip of a bunch of different businesses and sort of like co-ops and other things. But then there's a freeway that's right through it, and I'll discuss a little bit about that later. But the area was never sort of rebuilt quite the same. It was never really quite the same after the attack. The weather, it's funny, the weather was actually all over the place. While I was there, it rained quite a bit. I was at one event for the massacre, and I said aloud, like without thinking, wow, this rain is annoying. And then an older woman wearing a head wrap, she came up to me and was like, that is the tears of our ancestors. You need to let that European mindset go, Black man. So I had to, she got me together. I had to know where I was at, basically, so that was hilarious to me. But for the next slide, Greenwood, let's see, was home to churches, schools, community organizations. I believe it estimated 200 Black-owned businesses by 1921. So there were doctors, lawyers, pilots, shoe shiners, barbers, grocers, realtors. There were all these sorts of professionals that flourished in the area. Booker T. Washington at the time had called Greenwood Negro Wall Street, and that turned into, people started to call it Little Africa because of its self-sufficiency of the area. So just a bit of backstory about Black Wall Street, a violent white mob descended on Tulsa, Tulsa's thriving Black neighborhood of Greenwood, which was known as Black Wall Street. It destroyed homes. They destroyed homes, businesses. They killed hundreds. Churches were bombed. Pregnant women were attacked. Children were murdered. They razed about 35 square city blocks. And when you're in Tulsa, you can kind of feel the remnants of the massacre that are around the area. So the photo on the left is Vernon AME, Vernon African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded in 1905. It's the only standing Black-owned structure on Greenwood Avenue from that Black Wall Street era. To the photo in the middle, there are a number of these plaques that are actually placed into the street of Greenwood Avenue. These plaques are marked with the names of Black-owned businesses that were destroyed in the massacre, and some of them detail if they were reopened or not. And then to the right, this photo was really interesting because the bricks in this building were charred Black, and they were worked by heat. These are actual bricks that were reclaimed from the aftermath of the massacre. So there's some burned brick, melted brick that were dug out from the original buildings on Black Wall Street that were actually used in the rebuilding of some current structures in Greenwood. So just when you think about that in a lot of ways, the residents of Tulsa are still living with the history of the massacre every day, all day around them. So the origins of the massacre are a bit hazy. What we do know is that Sarah Page, a white woman, she screamed while she was riding an elevator with a shoe shiner by the name of Dick Rowland. We don't really know what happened to this day. Page reportedly never told the police that he harmed her or anything. But the Tulsa Tribune, like many newspapers of his day, published a story with the headline, "Nab Negro for attacking girl in an elevator." So a sensationalized racist headline, you can stop me if that sounds familiar. 100 years later, right? We're still having those sorts of conversations about headlines and racism in headlines. The Associated Press just updated its style guide in 2019 to say, okay, let's stop using racially charged, let's call a thing a thing. Let's call racist acts racist, right? So we're still having these sorts of conversations in media. And to the next slide. And so on the next slide, I took this photo of Viola Fletcher, who was 7 years old when she and her family were forced to flee their home during the massacre. Her words that she said in front of the White House's Judiciary, Civil Rights and Civil Liberties Subcommittee, she said these words in May. They were really haunting to me because she hasn't forgotten. She hasn't forgotten what happened. She was a child at the time, but she still thinks about those things today. They had the survivors, there are 3 survivors. They had them running around all all week. It was really amazing. I was tired after like the second day, but they had them pretty much out, everywhere because, this is important to them. They're still, very, very sharp. They still know what's going on. And, they were just really sort of excited to get their word out, their perspective out. So I won't read the quote, but this quote is, if you can take a look at it, it's just really sort of a haunting quote, and I want to include it in the presentation. So for the next slide, let's see if it works. I hope it works. Oh, this is actually okay. So this is actually another slide another photo I took. This was at the Greenwood Rising event. So Greenwood Rising is like a $30 million museum that's being built. But there was a lot of tension between the two, between sort of combating factions of people that were concerned about Tulsa, and reparations. So the surviving victims of the attack and their descendants, they say they haven't had any say in the commemorations, right? So they're fighting for reparations now. So my colleague, Taryn Finley, wrote a great article about this that I really want you all to read. It's called The 1921 Race Massacre and What Survivors and Descendants Are Owed. So it's been estimated that the white mob decimated more than $200 million of Black property in today's dollars. These residents were actually protesting. They're upset with Greenwood Rising because that 30 million is going toward this massive museum, but they say that they haven't actually seen any money from it. They haven't seen any funds from it. So hearing sort of residents talk about, the gentrification of the Greenwood district, which has modern mixed-use developments, restaurants for a nearby baseball stadium, and other things. It reminds me sort of the conversation that we're having right now in Detroit, as far as gentrification and how these things have still, they persist over time. And so let's see, for the next slide, I guess this will be, yep, you can read the article if you want right there. Okay, yeah, so these are more photos of people I got to talk to. That plaque on the photo on the left, that is a kind of a monument to the different shops and offices and things that were burned down during the Tulsa riot or massacre. And so this person here, she was pointing out her great grandfather's organization that he had founded. I talked with this grandmother here who brought her grandchildren, and told her it was super important. And then these are, let's see, the photo at the bottom is sort of like all the unpaid claims, unpaid financial claims that people filed, as insurance. So let's see, we'll go to the next slide. Okay, let's see if this works. It's a video.
Turn me around, I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up the freedom way. Ain't gonna let no racism turn me around. Oh, turn me around. Oh, turn me around. Ain't gonna let no racism turn me around. I'm gonna keep on walking, keep on talking, walking up to freedom. One more time.
Okay, yeah. So that was a really cool moment. We captured that moment at President Biden's speech on Tuesday when he traveled to Tulsa and spoke at the Greenwood Cultural Center, which is a museum that's dedicated to all of the basically everything that happened in 1921 and beyond. These are the three known survivors of the 1921 massacre who are still living. Viola Fletcher, who I spoke about before, 107. Leslie Benningfield Randall, who's 106, and Hughes Van Ellis, who's 100 years old. So that's Reverend William Barber who led them in singing the civil rights song, "Ain't Nobody Gonna Let Me, Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around." So I thought that was just a really sort of powerful moment. See, and we can go on to the next slide.
Turn me around, I'm gonna.
Okay, and so on my last night in Tulsa, I was invited to a rooftop event that gave me a beautiful view of the city. It was here that I was able to fully take in the view of Tulsa and really see just what was done to the area. So I really kind of just had to sit and think about it, because after I left, after all of the national outlets left, after the commemoration events were over, people in Tulsa still have to deal with this history, right? They still have to deal with their troubled past that stretches all the way to the present. So from the sky, I was able to see the interstate that goes through Greenwood Avenue, and it kind of ensured that the area, known as Black Wall Street, was never going to be able to fully rebuild. I immediately thought about Detroit's own Black Bottom neighborhood, which had 300, I believe, an estimated 300 Black-owned businesses, and it was kind of like our own Black Wall Street. The whole neighborhood was wiped out to make way for I-75 and I-375. So there are plenty of instances throughout our country's history. When I posted this on Facebook, a bunch of people responded with instances from their hometown. So I learned about Charleston, West Virginia, the Triangle District, which was a prominent stop for Black musicians along the Chitlin Circuit. It was destroyed after interstate was put through it. Miami, Florida, there was a neighborhood by the name of Overtown, a thriving Black district before I-95 was built right through it. Dallas, Nashville, Durham, New Orleans, Kansas City. You can keep LA, you can keep going. There are all sorts of cities, around the country that have experienced this. So let's see, the next slide is kind of my best attempt at creating like a map. Let's see if it comes up. I created like a map of just so you can kind of see how pervasive racism. Oh, there it goes. So you can kind of see how pervasive racism is throughout our and how structural racism sort of built into America's transportation system. I tried to eyeball it, so there are some places here, but you can kind of see like just how many cities and areas, and this is by no means a comprehensive map, but you can kind of see just how pervasive this is in our own transportation system. So that's it. That is what I have. I will take any questions. Thank you.
Philip, thank you so much for sharing that information. Before we get started, just a reminder, we're going to start the question and answer session right now. If you have not done so, please put your questions in the Q&A box or in the chat function on Facebook Live. First thing I want to say, Phil, again, thank you so much for sharing your vision and insight for your trip. It is very inspirational and eye-opening for many of us. I appreciate you showing the parallels of the de-urbanization and gentrification, a lot of Black historical communities. The first thing that you mentioned that freeway was Detroit itself, 75. I have, grandparents and family members who lived throughout that time. And again, they were displaced. So even my father and his childhood home was displaced during the 1950s, 60s. So, we are very privy to that history as well. So I appreciate that. First question that I have, what in your opinion is the impact of changing the term Tulsa Race Riot to its current state of being known as a Tulsa Race Massacre? What kind of feedback have you gotten with the kind of the name change from riot to massacre?
Yeah, well, working in journalism, you have to understand sort of like the power of words, right? So when you call something a riot, you can kind of blame everybody or blame nobody at all almost, right? But when you call somebody a massacre, that means a crime has been done or a crime has been committed, So I think that it's important for people to understand not only like the historical aspect, like, no, this was a crime committed upon a group of people, but it's also that means that because a crime was committed, that means that there is financial restitution. There are some reparations that should be involved. It changes the entire conversation and the entire dynamic when you change just that one word. And I think the push to actually call it a massacre is obviously in Tulsa. I think they've always sort of known it to be that, but nationwide, now that it's being taught, in sort of a national capacity. I mean, they didn't start teaching it in Tulsa schools actually, or in the Oklahoma school district at large. They didn't start teaching it until a few years ago, or maybe a year ago, or something like that. Like it's very recent, and so it's important to kind of change those words around so we can kind of have a better understanding of the history. When it's a riot, you don't have to blame anybody. You can just say, oh, it was a riot, everybody was involved, everybody was involved in this, and that just wasn't the case.
Absolutely, thank you for that. Next question we have: what is the significance of the victims of the massacre breaking their silence? President Biden visiting Tulsa and the world finally acknowledging the tragedy that occurred there. And I know you also were present when President Biden was down in Tulsa as well. So kind of tell me more about that and its significance.
Yeah, so Biden he is actually the first president to acknowledge that a crime was committed. He was the first president to acknowledge that the Tulsa race massacre was just that. So that was significant I guess I would say for a number of reasons, but the most important reason was to actually bring it even more so into the mainstream. I think that there were a lot of people who probably haven't heard of the Tulsa race massacre until the show Watchmen, right? Until the show when Watchmen came out. That, from my knowledge, that is when a lot of the conversation started about Tulsa. I think, obviously there were people who knew about it before, but that really sort of jumped, that kind of boosted folks' kind of awareness of the event. And then from there on, it started to reach sort of like the cultural consciousness, like nationwide. So having a president acknowledge like this was something that was done is one step, but I think that the descendants and survivors, they want to go they would like for it to go one step further and say like, okay, well, we're still dealing with these effects. How will we be repaid, right? Like that was a common theme that I heard whenever I talked with people that were down there. They were saying like, well, it's nice, but when you all leave, we still have to deal with this. Like we still have PTSD from these sorts of things. There are survivors who still have that, and then there are others, descendants who are saying, like, look, there's a freeway sitting on top of what I was owed. Like this is my great grandfather's business. I could have that business. That business could have been passed down to me. So especially when we're dealing with a time right now where there are bills being passed to combat quote unquote critical race theory and to combat actual historic events, like in Texas, where they're passing bills to actually stop teachers from teaching history. It's important to kind of know about, it's important to get these sorts of stories out into the mainstream and out into the front, but that's not where they would like to stop. They want to see reparations for this.
I'm glad you mentioned critical race theory. Another question I have: how do bills challenging critical race theory in public schools affect the whitewashing of history, especially after the Tulsa race massacre was virtually erased from history for years, right? And so, how do these bills, that are being created, with this history, how is that really being affected?
Well, the funny thing about this critical race theory boogeyman is that I don't think I know of any middle schools or elementary schools that are teaching critical race theory. I think I was learning about that in college. You know, I was sociology major, so this is not really something that's super new to me. But I mean, it's a boogeyman that we can point to and say, like, look, they're trying to hide something, right? Like it's like this is not even a this is really not even a thing, but they're preemptively trying to kind of almost halt students from learning about sort of like America's past. You know, like it's not just like, oh, George Washington appeared and then there was a war here and there, and then somebody freed the slave. Like it's not like it's not quite like that. You know, like there's a push to prevent students from actually learning about the real history. So like these things like this, like America bombed a city in 1921, an American city in 1921, and killed, you know, hundreds of Black folk. And that's the sort of thing that students need to, they do need to learn that, you know, and I don't think there are any other bills. There's no bills that will be able to prevent people from learning those sorts of things. So it's just, it's a boogeyman that really just does not make sense to me. If you want your students to learn about the actual history of America.
Absolutely, I totally agree. You know, it's very key to learn about these things because, you know, we are still dealing with this systemically. And us, you know, as young people, you know, our children and going forward, we're still, you know, facing the repercussions from what happened 100 years ago. So it's really important for us to continue to learn so we can try to be proactive, you know, in some of those systems and practices. The last question that I want to ask before we conclude, you know, my grandfather, he is 94 years old from Forest City, Arkansas, born in 1927. And we were looking at some of the footage on CNN, and he, not up until maybe a couple of years ago, had no idea that this massacre happened, right? And he, you know, he was just mind blown. He's been watching this coverage for the past week or so and, you know, telling me, you know, did you know this? And did you know that? And again, we're talking about the acknowledgement. We're talking about, you know, just the know-it-all that this happened. You know, because Greenwood was silenced for so long, how can we be sure that events like this don't happen elsewhere? And how do we properly acknowledge those events and try to make amends with the past?
Yeah, so I think that we do have the benefit of the internet, right? And we have the internet, we have the benefit of a sort of democratized, like social media platforms and the internet, and we're able to tell our stories in a way that is, you know, we're still sort of working toward, but we can tell our stories now, and that's why I'm in journalism, right? Like that's why I'm in journalism, because I'd love to be able to tell these sorts of stories and tell the stories that I feel like are sort of underrepresented in media, and we just have to keep telling our stories, and that's the main way. You know, like that's really what it is. Like our ancestors were not able to tell their stories for fear of retaliation, for fear of, like, you know, attack. We're able to do so, and so we sort of do ourselves a disservice when we're not telling our stories in, you know, in that capacity. So that's really, I mean, that's really what it comes down to. You know, like there's this all sorts of things out there, all sorts of stories out there that people want to know about, you know. And so in journalism, that's what we can do now, you know. And I really appreciate sort of being in this field, because I can do that. You know, I can up, and not only just tell stories that I find interesting, but I can research and talk about these things. And hopefully I have informed some people about some things that maybe they didn't know. Or if when you read Taryn's article, you can read more about things that maybe you didn't know about Tulsa. So there's still much more to know. There's a lot of stories within the major story of Tulsa, of the race massacre. There are a lot of mini stories in there. When I visited the Greenwood Cultural Center, there's like a room that actually has photos. It has photos of people who survived the massacre, and then they have their stories laid out, so you can actually read. There's a lot to know. So I was
Phil, I really appreciate you mentioning that. I know we're needing to wrap up, but we do have the article link from his colleague Taryn Finley, her coverage, and it is in the chat box for everyone to take a look. Phil, I really want to thank you again for sharing your story and spending time with United Way today. Again, we appreciate you for being here. And I'm going to introduce Andre to come back again for a few closing words so we can wrap up this session. Again, Phil, thank you so much. Andre, all yours.
All right, thank you, Courtney and Phil. As you all so brilliantly placed it, it is important that we remember the historical and yet persisting inequities within our community and take action to center equity and lift the community voice that represents so much of our America that has been traditionally marginalized. Now listen, as a reminder for those of you who may be experiencing a need, our 211 helpline remains available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We maintain a running list of available services in the community and can connect you to the supports you need. You also can look up resources in our area by using 211 resource database at unitedwaysem.org/211. Again, let me say that, at unitedwaysem.org/211. Now, if you're enjoying these town halls, I need you to like, share, comment. Let's get a dialogue going around what we're sharing here, especially in this equity town hall about the Tulsa race massacre, but also about the other subject matter that we share on a weekly basis at What's the Word Wednesdays. Now listen, the town hall team is taking a 2-week hiatus, a very well-deserved rest up and recharge. But we will see you back here for another What's the Word Wednesdays on July 14th, where we will be joined by Marissa Kovac with the ACLU to discuss all things voters' rights. To see our previous town halls and more upcoming topics, please visit unitedwaysem.org/virtual town halls. unitedwaysem.org/virtual town halls. The website will also include in the chat box. Again, Courtney, Phil, and everyone, thank you. We will see you soon. Stay safe and enjoy these next few weeks of summer. Thank you.